That should have got you excited, man, because when we see Jesus, the head of the church, comes back and makes connection with his body, it's us.
Amen.
We'll understand what game change looks like. That's this life of Christianity, this new life, this new birth that we experience is, he was dying to give that to us.
Amen.
The Son of God, who is God, was dying to give that to you and me. And so just the fact that we could ever be in the presence of Jesus, man, that makes it all worth it. I hope you're excited this morning. If you're not, we're going to kind of get there together. I don't know how you couldn't be after the worship, after that song. If you have your Bibles this morning, go ahead and turn them to Acts chapter 15. We're still in Acts 15. In a series called Acts. We've talked about some interesting stuff in Acts chapter 15 because, like we said, there's a transitionary period in the church happening because, of course, you get people doing the work of God. It's not going to be long before you have to reconcile some differences. I'm sure you could be trustworthy, which that's a big task, but most historically, people have failed miserably at it. You have the task that only Jesus can accomplish, and he says, you go and do it, and you're going to do greater things than I did.
Yeah.
We stay clueless to what even that means. But he gives us a task that he's only equipped to do. We do it, and then when we mess it up, you know what we do? We kick ourselves because of it. We weren't designed to do his task. We were designed for him to do his task through us.
Amen.
Now, so Acts chapter 15, we started out dealing with an issue in the church where people were saying, yeah, it's good that you know Jesus, but you're going to need this other stuff too. And if any of you ever grew up around church or in church, you know that is what the church does. Salvation belongs to Jesus, but sanctification belongs to the church. Maybe you didn't grow up in that church. Most of you did, and if you don't get what I was just saying, what we do is we trust Jesus to save people, but to keep them right, that's our job. So what we do to organize and to manage that chaos is we create a bunch of rules that Jesus never created because we're trying to manage the chaos of people and call it church. Well, they ran into that same problem, and so they called a council of the elders of the original church, the apostolic church. And when I say apostolic, I'm not talking about a denomination. I'm talking about the real apostolic church, the ones that were the apostles. So you're the original guys. Most of them have spent time with Jesus, and they're making the call. Is it Jesus plus something, or is it just Jesus? Everybody can answer that with their mouth, but do we answer it with our lives? We like the Jesus plus stuff. Because if you can white knuckle your life and say you know Jesus, you know what you are really? A miserable, bound up Christian. So your Christianity is actually in check there because there's no freedom in your life. You're not actually saying no to anything. You're just fighting a yes.
Wow.
That's how I wound up in New Birth. I was a master of fighting the yes. And every time that rules creep into my life to try to guard against chaos, that's what I wind up doing again. And that's what many of us wind up doing. That's where stress comes from. That's where bad decisions come from. You get stressed, then you get tired, then you start making bad decisions. Anybody relate with that?
Yes.
I mean, But Jesus, the one that we are called his body, didn't die to give us that.
No.
He died so that we would have life, and that more abundantly. So hopefully what happens is we start to see things in the early church, and we can avoid those pitfalls in our lives moving forward. So we talked about the Jerusalem Council and how they straightened out the problem. You know, it's not Jesus plus anything, it's just Jesus. So that was new ground because they had already let religion creep into the church. Only 15 years old. It's 2000 now. Has it creeped in again? About 3,000 times in 2,000 years. But what happened is we saw that this new ground that they broke was an understanding of the gospel. Prophesied in the Old Testament, fulfilled in the New. And that was God's original plan from the beginning. Now we're about 15 years into the church planting gospel in the book of Acts. And we're in chapter 15. It's easy to remember timelines right here. Jesus died. 15 years later, here we are. And we're in a place called Antioch, where people were first called Christians. It took us a while to get out of Jerusalem. It's going to take us a while to get out of Antioch. But Antioch has got kind of like a gospel station for missionaries, because they're going out. We know that Antioch's about 300 miles from Jerusalem, and they went on their first, Paul and Barnabas went on their first mission trip in about a 500-mile loop and wound up back in Antioch. When they got back into Antioch, it's when they had to call the council. They dealt with the council, and now what we're going to pick up and read today is another issue that we deal with in the church. Any church. Because you heard Crystal say this morning, people come into your life for different reasons. Some for a reason, some for a season, some for a lifetime, right? Well, we're going to look at one of those today, because when you're doing the work of the gospel, don't get mad when somebody is only in your life for a season. Their assignment was not a lifetime with you.
Right.
But many times when we have relationships with people and we're walking with God and growing in God with people, man, we get tight with those people. And when their season is up in our life and they leave, we want to hold on to things too long.
Yes.
And look, this is what I'm going to tell you is very beneficial knowledge learned from many blood, sweat, and tears in my life. When you hold on to a relationship that God has changed seasons on, it becomes toxic to you and them.
Wow.
Let's look at Acts chapter 15. We're going to start reading in verse 36, because here's the title of the message today. Everybody say this in unison. I pressed on. Now, slap the person next to you, because you know some of them is asleep. Slap them real good, especially Nick. Slap Jake real good. And if I need to, just holler at me. Huh? And tell them, press on. Now look back to that same person that just said that to you and tell them, I pressed on. And I'm going to keep pressing on. Look, the thing is, you're going to come to a point in life where some of the people that are around you right now, this is not including married couples, okay? What I'm about to say does not include you if you're married. But otherwise, you can look around this room, and there's a portion of these people that will not be in your life next year this time.
Amen.
And you say, well, that's not cool. I thought we were all supposed to be together forever. Well, that's just not the way God wired it. Because some people are in your life for a reason, some for a season, and some for a lifetime. And I promise you, you will find out which. Because remember, you can't hold on to them once God releases them. You want to hurt? You want gray hair? You want to know why most people say that the deepest hurts of their life were in church? It's because they choose to hold on to relationships God's released. Just let that sink in for a minute. Let's start reading in verse 36, chapter 15, the book of Acts. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
You there? Okay, good. And after some days, well, this don't make any sense because we're just like picked up in the middle of a sentence. Let me go back. It's not in here, but let me go back and read kind of where we were in the chapter before that, or the verses before that. So when they were sent off, they went down to Antioch. And after, this is verse 33, and after they had spent some time, they were sent off in peace by the brothers who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas, this means that the guys that were there for the council in Antioch went back to Jerusalem. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with so many others. So here's what happened. They had all these meetings. They went back and took a letter to the church in Antioch, read the letter. Everybody was acceptable of it. Everybody rejoiced. Everybody goes back to their own prospective places. But Paul and Barnabas said, we're going to stay here in Antioch. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. So they've just gotten back from the first mission trip. Rod can tell you this. When you go on a mission trip, one of the first things you want to do when you get back is to go again. It really is. There's so much cool stuff. Well, they're back. They've dealt with this theological issue in the Council of Jerusalem. And Paul says, let's go back. Let's make this 500-mile loop again, and let's check on all the churches that we've helped start. Because, the guys that we left in charge of these churches haven't really walked with the Lord a long time. And if we've had problems in Antioch and we've had problems in Jerusalem, then they're probably having problems in all these other places too. Let's go back. Now, Barnabas, this is very key right here. There's definitely a reason, but I'm going to show you something about a season. Now, Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. You ever heard of this guy? He wrote a pretty famous book in the Bible. It's the Gospel of Mark. Which is kind of funny that he wrote the Gospel of Mark, because you know what his name Mark means originally? Son of Zeus. Or maybe it's son of Thor. It's one of the Greek gods. But he was a Greek. His dad was Greek anyway. His mom was a Jew, his dad was Greek. But Barnabas, who was his cousin, wanted to take him with him. And if you go back in the book of Acts to chapter 13, verse 13, it says that Barnabas took with him John Mark on their first mission trip. Doesn't say a lot in 13:13 about what happened. But it does explain a little bit here. Let's go to the next slide. But Paul thought it best not to take with them. Listen to this. Paul thought it best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and not gone on with them to do the work. So in Paul's life, John Mark was a season. There has been much debate over this among theologians, commentarians. Matthew Henry, which is an amazing commentary writer, actually disagrees with a lot of people on this. You know what? It really doesn't matter what anybody thinks, because there's just simply not enough evidence to know the why. We're going to keep reading and try to figure this out. Paul thought it best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and not gone on to do the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement. Do you know that these guys have known each other, walked together between 11 and 15 years? Brothers in Christ, Barnabas and Paul. They love each other. But over this one guy, there arose a great disagreement. Basically is this. On our first missionary trip, This guy John John Mark made it about halfway. And you know what he decided to do? I'm going back to the house. He went back to the house and they finished the work. So the next time, and that's Barnabas' cousin. And you can just imagine if you're doing something very significant and somebody said, hey, I'm going to bring my cousin. Okay, first red flag. Because number one, you bring your cousin ain't going to do nothing. And number two, your cousin might fall off halfway and decide he needs to go home. Because two things about missions work and about ministry work is, number one, it's taxing spiritually. It's taxing physically. I mean, all work is, but it's a double whammy when you're dealing with ministry work. Because not only are you having to maintain spiritually, not only are you missing your family that are back home. Anybody relate? Okay, let's just try to be honest here. Not only are you missing your family, not only are you taxed physically because you're traveling all the time, but hey man, I just don't want to do this anymore. You know what? A nice hot shower and a meal would be really good right now. And when we get up to Pamphylia, what I'm going to do is y'all keep going and I'm going to jump on a boat and go back home. That was Barnabas' cousin. So when Barnabas calls Paul up and says, hey, you really do want to go on this second missionary trip? What we're going to do, I'm going to bring my cousin again. How'd that hit you? Seasoned. He was a seasoned. But see, if you read this, is it not hard to try to choose sides here? I mean, look, if you read the Bible anything like I do, you do try to choose sides. Like some of you are choosing sides right now. Because you're sitting there thinking, man, why did Paul do that? Like, that doesn't sound like Jesus. And why did Barnabas try to bring his mama's boy little cousin with him? You understand? You're choosing sides. You're trying to figure something out that wasn't designed for you to figure out because there's simply not enough evidence. But I do it too. You know why? Because we want to know who deserves justice and who deserves mercy.
That's right. Oh, that's good.
Because guess what? Guess what you deserve? Always. Mercy. You know what everybody else deserves? Justice.
That's good.
So you're trying to pick sides just like I would try to pick sides, because who is right? Well, let's see what the scripture says. And there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated. You know, we've talked about this. At what point do you break fellowship? Over essentials, right? They separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas. Slap somebody and say Silas. Silas. He plays a key role here. Paul chose Silas and departed. Listen right here. This one little phrase. Having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, here's what happened. If you were to just read this, and especially reading it out of context, kind of like we are today, you know, we just picked up, say this is your first Sunday, you don't know what happened the last 14 and a half chapters of the book of Acts, and you've just jumped in and you're like, well, it's easy to decide. I'm just going to pick a side. You know, Barnabas seems to act more like Jesus. Paul seems to act more like my worst boss in history. You know? But the churches, the brothers, the elders commended Paul's decision. So what do we do with that information? I think one of the things we have to do is we have to look at our own lives. And especially as we begin this walk with Christ personally, and things get more taxing, I think we try to understand the characters involved here. First being John Mark. Let's try to understand him. Not so much his feelings, but what he is wearing. Because his cousin called him up, asked him to go on this mission trip, which a mission trip then is not like a mission trip now. Like, they weren't going on a mission trip to Milan to Fashion Week. I can't put this on the internet now. They were going on a mission trip that could very well make them lose their lives by sharing the gospel. Because historically, none of these guys' story ends well. But if we're understanding John Mark, he gets called up from his home to go with his cousin on a mission trip. It might have sounded exciting at first, but when you're going into towns that believe all this different stuff, telling them about this Jesus, and they're not really receiving you, and you really don't have the gift of communication like Paul does. Like, because Paul's going in, and he's just blowing everybody's mind, and everybody thinks, wow, and he's laying hands on the sick, and they're being healed, and you're just like, what in the world? But I go into these towns, and I talk to people, and they're just like spitting on me. I'm going home to mama. You know what I'm saying? You kind of begin to understand that it's a little stressful. And I want you to look at some stats. Is that the last scripture?
Yeah, the last scripture.
Okay. I want you to look at some stats that I read this morning. And you're like, this is when you prepare? No, this is not when I prepare. This is when I was reading these stats. Because 23% of pastors, this is a study done by Lifeway, 23% of pastors acknowledge they personally struggled with mental illness. That includes depression, anxiety, all kinds of stuff. 23% of pastors admit that they've personally struggled that way. 49% of pastors say they rarely or ever speak to their congregation about it. The issue, not their struggle, the issue. Either or. It should be both and. Only 27% of churches have a plan to assist families affected by mental illness. 65% of church-going family members of those who suffer from mental illness want the church to talk openly about mental illness. 59% of the people that struggle with it say the same thing. 76% of churchgoers say suicide is a problem that needs to be addressed from the pulpit. 32% of people say that they have a close family a close acquaintance or a family member that has personally died of suicide. 80% of pastors say that their church is equipped to assist somebody who is threatened to take their own life. 92% of pastors say their church is equipped to care for the family of somebody that does commit suicide. 4% of churchgoers who've lost a loved one say the church leaders were even aware of their struggles.
Wow.
Did you hear what I said? Like 90-something percent, 92% of pastors say that they're equipped to deal with a family that suffers family suicide. And only 4% say the church was even aware of the struggle. He's like, what does this have to do with that? Well, over the last year, I've seen time after time, it's been like 4 very high-profile pastors that weren't like mega church pastors necessarily, but high-profile pastors, meaning they hit the news, because these guys their pulpit would be empty on Sunday. Nobody really knew, but their pulpit would be empty on Sunday, only for their family to go home from church and find out that they had committed suicide that morning. It was real-life stuff. So these are pastors full on in the ministry, in the trenches. What about the people that are struggling and co-laboring with them? How much more would a John Mark be suffering from this word right here? Now I'm not trying to eisegete the text. What I'm trying to do is tell you that, guess where this comes from? Exhaustion?
Yes.
Actually, psychologists can't even identify where it comes from. They just know that it comes. Don't know where it comes from, don't know how to stop it. Don't even know how you can help somebody struggling with it, next to going down in the pit with them and just sitting quietly and telling them, when you get ready to come out, I'm here. See, we don't know that John Mark wasn't struggling with this. Because guess what will cause depression? Some of the things that will cause depression. Missing your family. Missing your life, missing your friends. Being a little overworked and a little underpaid. Those kind of things. The stress of everyday life will cause you to get in a funk if your focus is on the wrong thing. See, this is something that we have to address, the fact that this does happen. Will everybody say they know somebody that struggles with depression? Do you know it's not a fun thing to deal with? It's definitely not a fun thing to have. You know why the church don't talk about it? Because if we talk about it, then we sound a little flawed. And who needs to be in church where you say you're blessed and highly favored all the time when you got flaws? I don't know if I can. Who needs to admit their flaws when if anybody were to walk up and ask you how you're doing, what's your canned answer? I'm blessed, brother. Highly favored among the Lord. And really, on the inside, you didn't even want to get out of bed that day. What do you do? Because I've talked to a lot of people, and I've even read some of those books. You know, some of those books about people that said they had a dream and they went to hell and all this stuff. The closest things that I can associate are what I've read about people going to hell and people struggling with depression. A pit, a hole, darkness, something closing in around you, stifling, can't breathe. Those type of things are very real. But I heard a preacher that told me this one time, and it's kind of always stuck. He was one of those one-liner zinger kind of guys. But I love this, and it always stuck with me. He said, what do you do if you're going through hell? Keep going. Because if you're going through hell, the last thing you want to do is stop. Keep going. See, I think when we read this whole thing, now this text that we're reading, could or couldn't, we just plugged in a word, depression. This could be anything. This could be an anger issue. This could be any type of struggle that's causing you not to want to press in. And I'm going to tell you what, when I read this story, I was a little angry at Paul because I was like, dude, why do you got to be so intense? I mean, the guy left and went home. He could have had any number of problems. So why did you just make this big deal and split with Barnabas over this situation? No, he ain't going. If he gets on this bus, I'm getting off. Why did Paul make that big of a deal? Because you want to think, man, that's not what Jesus would have done, is it? And I want to ask. Because, see, I started running over Scripture in my mind. That's how my mind works. I started going, well, Jesus did say, if you have something against your brother and you are standing at the altar with your offering, leave your offering there and go make it right with your brother, then come back. Didn't he say that? Yeah. I also remember something else he said. He said, if you were to put your hands to the plow, and if you turn back from your hands to the plow, you're not worthy of the kingdom. So I'm like, dang. And that's not contradictory statements. It's relational statements. And see, when you read that and you find out the whole story, it makes sense. Paul's smart. They commended him for good reason. Because they knew that Paul was not going to let this offense lie. But they also knew that if you put your hands to the plow and look back, what did Jesus say? Let the dead bury their own dead. I don't even understand that. I was like, what, did Jesus just wake up on a bad day that day? Because he wouldn't even let one of his buddies go to his own family's funeral. And I'm like, dang, that's rough. Well, what happened? Paul stood his ground. If he gets on the bus, I'm getting off. He's getting on. Well, I'm getting off. Silas, you get off too. Silas like, yeah, this is Paul. I'm going with you, brother. And they separate. And you know one of the things that the scripture records? It was never noted whether Paul and Barnabas made up. But you know what? What both of them did? They knew, actually not both of them, all of them, they knew something. And the reason I plugged this word in wasn't like something I saw in the text or anything. The reason I plugged this word in is because it so eats away at the church. In the time we live in now, a time where we can't decide whether it's the work of God or the God of the work that we should choose.
Wow.
So depression ensues in our lives, not necessarily in theirs. Use this word because of some brilliant little college student, or maybe it was a college student, she's 23, that made a little stumble upon this word depression. And you guys might have seen this, that when you take the letters of this word, let's put that next slide up. If you add the ED, it says, I pressed on. Which is what John Mark went on to do. Because Barnabas took him with him, and Barnabas saw something in that little joker. Paul saw a mama's boy at that season. Barnabas didn't see a mama's boy. He saw a world changer. He mentored John Mark, and guess what John Mark went on to do? Basically evangelize Egypt.
Yes. There you go.
And if you do church history, Alexandria became one of the prime pinnacles of church history. And guess who was the main person there? John Mark. So you have to say, man, what happened? I want to show you something. I'm not going to go to all these things, but I want to show you how it ended with John Mark. Turn to Colossians. I don't think I had this in. No, I didn't have this one. Colossians chapter 4. It's on page 993. Colossians chapter 4. This isn't later in Paul's ministry because, he did go on another mission trip. At the end of his mission trip, he starts foreseeing how bad things are going to go. But eventually he winds up in Rome in jail, waiting to have his head cut off. Now, you think you've had a prison sentence. That was a pretty rough one. But look, in his prison stay, here's what Paul writes. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. He's writing a letter to the Colossian church, and this is his closing. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. And Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning who you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Years later, same guy. When Paul is in prison waiting to die, Paul is sending John Mark out. And you know what else Paul learned from this? This pressing on? He learned something very discerning about Barnabas. That Barnabas saw something in a young man that he didn't see at the time. So guess what? When he and Silas get to Turkey, Lystra, which is Turkey nowadays, when they get there, he runs into this very interesting young man. And we're going to study more about him in the book of Acts as it goes on. But Paul, from Barnabas' example, Paul runs into a young man named Timothy. And he sees something in Timothy that nobody else sees. And he decides to pour his life into this young man to help Timothy get what John Mark got, which was mentorship of a younger generation. Pretty profound. Timothy's a pretty popular guy too in the Bible. He does some pretty cool stuff. But it's neat that Paul finally learns this. What's that saying? I think it's saying a lot just in this little piece of text. One, you're not always going to agree with everybody. Because it's true. There are going to be some people that are in your life for a season. There's going to be some people that are in your life forever. And hopefully you can find a blend of it. Try not to get too close too quick unless God is leading everything. It'll save you some pain. But when God leads things, follow his leading. When he says stay, stay. When he says go, go. And I ain't talking about go from the ministry. Let me just stop for a second, segue into something, because whatever you discussed and look, I know because I stayed 2 years after I finished. Whatever you sat down and talked to John Brown about date-wise, the weird thing is God established that. Now, that means that in the middle, he's not going to change his mind. You might. But don't put God's stamp on an early out. Put a stamp on whatever the leadership says. Because what you don't want is you don't want Wayman doing a Paul and saying, oh, he's coming back. He ain't getting on this bus. I'm kidding. But I just wanted to say that because, when I say something about if he stay, go, go, I don't want you going back and saying, Wayman, I'm out. Scott preached about it this morning. Deuces. I just had to put that in there in case the recording goes online. Okay, I can pull it up and show him. I did not give anybody permission. But the thing is, in all things, we need to learn lessons. Because, you know what? Me and you have in common, we're going to mess up. If you're in ministry, and you are in ministry, if you're a child of God, you are a minister of reconciliation. So we're in ministry together. We ain't always going to see eye to eye. I'm always going to love you. You're always going to say you love me. At least to my face. Hopefully. Not all. I don't know why I do that. Have you ever, well. There's, when you speak publicly, there's some people in the room, avoid looking at them. Just avoid it. But but here's the thing. Seasoned people come and go. Keep pressing on. Whatever you do, if you're depressed, if you're struggling, if you have something that feels heavy on you, keep pressing. Because you know what? Jesus said this profound thing. He said, come to him if you're burdened down, if you've got heavy weights on, just come to him. And he will take the weight and share it with you. Which he'll take the heavier part of it. But you got to give it to him. You got to go to him. You got to give it to him. And he'll show me and you that even though we do mess up, that he will walk with us and show us how to live free and light. And that's beautiful. So depression comes, sing.
Yeah.
Stress comes, pray. Somebody gets on your nerves, give them a hug. Not too tight. And do it with your hands in your pocket if you're too angry. Because you don't want to go in for a hug and just in the throat with it. But there's a way to press through all this stuff. Because Paul learned a lot. John Mark went on to accomplish great stuff. And you know what? Through it all, because these guys kept getting up every morning, putting their pants on and putting one foot in front of the other, despite the way things looked, God made a way of reconciliation between Paul and John Mark. Hopefully, God made a way that Barnabas could witness this in some capacity. And these guys all went on to accomplish great stuff. And to die brutal deaths for the gospel. So no matter what's going on, just keep pressing. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other, because I'm not telling you that tomorrow is going to be better than today. What I will tell you is a guarantee that if you're a child of God, you will see Jesus again.
Right.
And that's what we're all looking forward to. You know, there's a day coming that we won't have any more questions, no more tears, no more stress, no more depression.
Yes, sir.
When there's a day that Zoloft will no longer be on the menu. There will come a day that it'll be all dry eyes, all joyful faces. And we have that promise to stand on. So let's stand this morning. And let's just make